Hello and a warm welcome to the programme from me, David Foster. Now, what is happening, really happening, in Saudi Arabia? A collapse in oil prices reports that the kingdom, if not massively in debt, is running very close to the line. And what will that mean to the wider region? Indeed, to the wider world. This is Roundtable. Hard up and Saudi Arabia are words that don't often go in the same sentence. Yet the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is trebling VAT to 15% from July, and his handling of an oil dispute with Russia is causing issues both at home and abroad.
Markets worldwide have seen a major collapse in oil prices. The coronavirus lockdowns and the massive reduction in travel has lessened global demand for oil. And the fallout of a dispute between Russia and Saudi Arabia over oil supply and price has further added to the sense of chaos. Saudi Arabia has been hit particularly hard. The government has long relied on the distribution of oil wealth to their citizens to maintain social stability. Experts say Saudi Arabia is slowly running out of money, its reserves dropping from $750 billion to $500 billion in the last 5 years. Now the Gulf monarchy plans to increase VAT tax rates to 15% and suspend various state subsidies as part of austerity measures to support its struggling economy. Other countries are affected too. Russia watchers say the country's rulers are also worried as stable resource revenues have been crucial to President Putin's 20 years in power. But lower prices may benefit China. It's a large importer of Middle Eastern oil, a key component of the country's journey to economic superpower. The price of oil has been volatile before, but are these recent falls set to bring about longer-lasting change?
In a short while, we'll be hearing from Jameel Ahmed from the financial broker FXTM and Nasim Ahmed, a political analyst at the Middle East Monitor. But first, let's say hello to David Des Roches, formerly the Director of Arabian Affairs at the US Department of Defense, Nick Butler, a visiting professor at King's College London and an energy commentator at the Financial Times. Great to have you both on the programme. David, let me ask you first of all, you've suggested that there is a changing of the social contract between the Saudi monarchy, the ruling families, and the people of Saudi Arabia. How are we seeing that?
Well, the biggest aspect of that is the tripling of the VAT. So prior to the recent developments, the informal contract, and nothing is written here, was that in return for political acquiescence and basically no political participation, services are provided by the state at no charge from the oil wealth of the state. But what we're seeing now is that subsidies on things like electricity, gasoline are being eliminated. And at the same time, VAT was introduced a few years ago at 5%. It's just been tripled to 15%. So that is a fundamental change. And what it shows is that people are going to have to work for their living, and they're expected to support the state as citizens rather than.
What I'm wondering is, you say basically it was you keep quiet, we'll give you money.
Right.
If you're taking money away from them now, they're not going to be very pleased about that. They're probably going to have to work harder. Will there be some kind of protest, some kind of social upheaval?
Depends on how it's handled. With the VAT, of course, you can always massage it so that basic commodities are not affected. And what you want to do is tax Birkin handbags and Gucci shoes, and you don't want to tax food, books, basic soap. So you can modify it in a way that you really hit this unaffected class. The other part, which I should have emphasized at the start, was that, of course, this wealth was unseen by the average Saudi. And so the potential is that people said, where is all the money going? When they see that they don't have basic services, but they see a royal family, the idea of imposing taxation, can actually be popular because it's seen as affecting people who are divorced from the everyday lifestyle. So there is a possibility this could actually strengthen the state and the social contract.
Nick, let me come to you. I think the price of oil for Saudi Arabia to break even has to be round about $83 a barrel. Respected commentators, perhaps yourself included, say it's never going to go above $80 a barrel in the future again. So if it costs $83 for the Saudis to break even and they're not getting anywhere near that, they are going to go, if not bust, then they're going to find life very difficult, aren't they?
Yes. I mean, I would never say never in the oil market. And I would never have said that it would get down to the current price, but it has. I would be surprised if it gets up to 80 anytime soon, because there's such a lot of supply around. I suspect there will be some further OPEC deal. I suspect the US will cut back production just under the pressure of market forces. But that leaves an overhang over the market, and I think that will keep prices depressed for some time. It's going to be very tough for Saudi Arabia. They've swum on a tide of high oil prices for many years. I think I agree with David. This could be the beginning of a change in the social contract. But if you want to do it seriously, you have to take some of the wealth and some of the power away from the Saudi royal family and distribute it more widely if you want to create a modern, serious economy. I'm not sure I see that yet.
Well, let me just read you something that David Petraeus, former soldier, former head of the CIA, said November of last year. Saudi Arabia is gradually running out of money. They'd be the first to acknowledge that the sovereign wealth fund has been reduced. It's somewhere below $500 billion now. The budget deficits each year, depending on the price of Brent crude, can be anywhere from $40 billion to $60 billion. So both of you this one, but you first of all, David, do you think the 2030 vision is dead, that it cannot now be afforded, which was going to be bring lots of tourists to the country, futuristic cities, diversification? Has that gone?
Well, I think that some of the big ticket items that were always sort of far-fetched, this idea of, it being a tourist destination exclusive of Islamic concerns, I think that those will have to be put on hold. But a lot of what Vision 2030 called for is implementable even in a time of fiscal structure. If you set aside the grand projet, this idea of people having to work for their living, this idea of introducing an entrepreneurial culture instead of one where people just strive to graduate from college, get a government job, never show up at work for the government job, get promoted regardless of what they do, and then retire. There has been a change in that. Saudi Arabia is a vastly different country than it was 5 years ago. But this idea that people are going to, take their discretionary income, fly over cheaper destinations that have sun and sand and drinking and, Western behavior mores like Sharm el-Sheikh or Italy or Greece. And they're not going to go to Dubai. They're going to go to this big new city. I think that's going to be put on hold.
Nick, do you think this means that Saudi Arabia's place, dictated only by its oil reserves and its massive wealth and its buying power as well, its place in the world hierarchy as an influencer is going to disappear?
Not disappear, but I think it's gone wrong over the last 5-10 years. I think the Vision 2030 was never real. It was a consultant's dream, which was sold to the Crown Prince, and it's just not going to happen. I think Saudi Arabia could be a serious player in the region. It could be a serious ally of the United States rather than being a source of embarrassment in places like Yemen. But I don't yet see the change. And if there isn't a change to a serious economy, a serious governance, and probably new leadership, then I think the influence of the country will decline, because oil is just not needed quite so much. Because
there were rumours, were there not, last week of rumblings about an attempted or possibly attempted coup. So when you say change of leadership, do you mean that Mohammed bin Salman, Crown Prince, heir apparent, will not assume the throne?
I think that there are many people in Saudi Arabia who are very unhappy at the destabilization that he has brought over the last 10 years. Saudi Arabia traditionally, and the royal family traditionally, have been sources of stability in the region, working with outside powers, but also working regionally through the Gulf Cooperation Council and other bodies. He's dropped all that, and it's an ego trip that has gone wrong. And so, yes, I'm not surprised by the rumors. I wouldn't be surprised if we're not back here talking about a change of regime within the next year or two.
David, let me ask you, I mean, you were at the Department of Defense, and Nick has brought up the war in Yemen. Stories in today's papers about how the lack of available cash for the Saudi regime means that it won't be able to go out and spend as much as it has done in the past on weaponry. Does that mean perhaps that it will have to scale back its commitments in conflicts like the one in Yemen?
The conflict in Yemen has been a disaster for Saudi Arabia. If you look at their strategic goals, they are farther away from it now than they would have been if they had just done nothing. So, you know, the billions that they've spent in Yemen, they could have had a ceremony at the National Stadium, set that on fire, and they'd be closer to their strategic goals than they are today. But so I think that, yeah, austerity usually forces hard decisions. A lot of the Western criticism of the Saudi defense infrastructure has been that they focus on equipment to the exclusion of all the other things that make a good army: training, personnel management, a system of merit-based promotions, retirements. So sometimes military learns more from defeat than from victories. I think the victory at Desert Storm really hamstrung the American Armed Forces. So, you know, it's possible this could be a good moment.
Yeah, we're talking about the available cash. What is it? It spends 8% of its GDP every year on weaponry. If it cannot afford to do that, will it become vulnerable?
No, I don't think so. I mean, one of the frustrating things for friends of Saudi Arabia is when we look at the vast amounts they spend on weaponry, the weapons don't really relate to the security challenges that the state faces. So, you know, air-to-air fighters, the F-15, which, you know, I worked on and I'm proud of, it's a world-class capability, but for what? You know, I mean, the air threat to Saudi Arabia comes from missiles. And if you want to use these fighters in an air-to-ground mode, you know, you might be better off with a cheaper platform, even a propeller-driven platform. When you look at the Saudi security concerns, a propeller-driven aircraft that is designed for air-to-ground combat would cost a fraction of these supersonic twin-jet fighters. Yeah, so they're
not vulnerable in the conventional sense. Nick, let me come to you, but vulnerable economically, and you believe, I'd like you to explain it to us, if you could, that there will be a redistribution of global oil wealth.
Yes, and it's taking place already. You see tens of billions of dollars, which until the beginning of this year were flowing into the region, are not flowing there anymore. And Saudi Arabia is still one of the richer countries. I think you're now seeing Iran, Iraq, Algeria, Libya, other countries losing money that they desperately need to maintain their society. And I think it is now one of the most unstable regions in the world. And this is something which, because of the virus and everything, people have not paid enough attention to. I think that creates instability in many countries. There's obviously a religious dimension as well. And I agree completely with David. The risks to Saudi Arabia are not something that will be dealt with by fighter jets. This is insurgency, popular unrest, and their neighbors. They live in a tough neighborhood.
Which is something we will be discussing in the second part of this program. Thank you both very, very much indeed. David Des Roches and Nick Butler. Okay, so let us now expand on some of the things we've been talking about in the first half of the program and say hello to Jameel Ahmed, Head of Market Research at the trading company FXTM, and also to Nasim Ahmed, a political analyst at the Middle East Monitor. Jameel, you'll tell us about the technicalities and the situation for all the GCC countries regarding the plummeting oil price in just a moment. But Nasim, I want to ask you, first of all, this is a double whammy. We have falling oil prices, therefore less income, and we have coronavirus, therefore less demand. Can Saudi Arabia see this through?
Well, I think when they initially made the decision to increase output, which thereby, affected oil prices, I think they would have calculated, that there's only so long they can survive with oil prices being in the 30s and the 20s. But as we know, it really isn't a long-term solution to any of their problems. The idea was to somehow undercut US shale oil. But that strategy was tried before in 2014. It really failed, and I reckon it will fail again. I don't think in the long term it can sustain it, because, as we know, Saudi is really in need of having to transition from oil to alternative source of income. And it needs to do that as soon as possible. And 2020, this year, was supposed to be a huge milestone in terms of achieving that goal.
But let us say that oil hangs around $40, $50 a barrel, and Saudi Arabia needs it to be, I think it's $83 a barrel, just to break even. Therefore, it has no income from that. It doesn't have an income from the Hajj, which we expect to be cancelled. The Vision 2030 is probably dead because there's no money to spend on it. Tourists won't be going there. Globalization will be shrinking. People won't be visiting it. Saudi Arabia's hopes lie where?
That's a big question, and I think you see the results of that within the kingdom. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has clamped down on opposition. He's clamped down. The most recent one is the son of King Abdullah, the previous King Abdullah, who passed away. So there are challenges to his reign. And the interesting thing would be what happens when his father, the current King Salman, passes away. King Salman has been a kind of a air cover for him. He's provided him with security and assistance in a way others won't. So what would happen when King Salman's air support does not exist to aid him in maintaining his hold on power? Of course, there are lots of talk about him being pushed aside and someone else, some new challenger coming in. But of course, there's a deeper problem within the Saudi kingdom itself. It's not really just King Salman. It's not really any of the individuals within the monarchy. It's a much more structural issue. And that, to be honest, the signs aren't really good. Science doesn't indicate that Saudis will be able to recover from this. And oil does not look like it's going to return to $80s and $90 a barrel. That just does not.
Well, some say never over 80.
Yeah.
Jameel, let me bring you in at this particular point. Do you agree with that premise that it's not going to be anywhere near $80 a barrel, therefore Saudi Arabia can't cover its costs, its ambitions are therefore having to be curtailed to some extent? Is it alone in this? Have other countries been able to diversify, GCC oil-producing countries, and therefore won't suffer the same kind of problems?
Great questions. I break them down. You never say never, but in this environment, it's extremely unlikely. And that's something, again, in finance, you're not supposed to really say, but it is very much unlikely in a global pandemic with the world economy in a shutdown level still. And these restrictions, or the implications of these restrictions, are going to last for a very long time, far longer than it's taken to get into this predicament. So on that basis, oil prices should certainly not be heading towards $40 or $50, let alone $80. But because of countries and economies are reopening up, we're seeing a bit more positivity in oil prices. But we have to remember, the rally we're seeing in oil prices right now, where they've moved above $30 today, that was previously seen as historic lows for oil prices if we go 4 or 5 years ago. Now, in terms of breaking it down, whether countries have really diversified, honestly, no. They've made some progress, and they've certainly built a narrative that they're going to diversify and really open up their economies to this era of globalization. But then you made the real good point in your intro. Globalization has a big question mark over its shoulders now because of this pandemic and the country nationalization that we could see, depending on where US and China trade discussions go after this. So the question is really, have they done enough? No. Have they tried? Certainly, yes. But it will still take decades to build a reliance away from oil. It took a very long time for the US to turn from being energy dependent to being energy independent. And it's going to take an even longer period.
It is now self-sufficient, the United States, so it doesn't need to rely on Saudi Arabia. What do you make of reports, Jameel, when you see that Saudi Arabia is putting some of its sovereign wealth fund, smaller than it used to be, but still pretty big, into companies such as Facebook, Boeing, Disney, and other things as well? Is that going to help keep the country afloat?
You've made, again, a key point. It's a small amount of money. What it does show is diversification. It also shows that Saudi's own narrative towards opening up, liberalization. You are seeing structural reforms, perhaps not at the pace that liberalists would like, but we're seeing something, which is sometimes better than nothing. So Saudi Arabia wants to become this huge open global economy in a way that the United Arab Emirates emerged 10 to 15 years ago. But again, it's going to take time. And the devil is always in the detail. Are you doing enough? Is the environment strong enough to hold that kind of sentiment? And whether it really will pay off? Yes, it can. But again, we're looking at an extremely long payoff in time here. And they could be worth the cost only if you're willing to hang on to that loss for a substantial period.
Let me read something that was written by David Hurst, editor-in-chief of Middle East Eye. The collapse of Saudi Arabia's economy would quickly be felt in Egypt, Sudan, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Tunisia, all of which send millions of their workers and professionals to the kingdom and whose economies have grown to depend on their remittances. Yes, that is the case. People who go to work in Saudi Arabia, if the jobs aren't there, if they cannot send money back, then their economies will suffer. But what will the other ripple effects be, do you think, Nasim, if Saudi suffers in the way that it does financially, appears to be heading?
Well, aside from the ripple effects and the lack of remittance going through to the other countries, I think it's not simply a case of Saudi Arabia collapsing. I think you have a number of other countries, namely China is invested heavily in the Middle East. China is now the #1 foreign investor in the Middle East since 2016. So I think it's in China's interest to help the region find some kind of stability with its Belt and Road project. So I think from that sense, I think Saudi may see some aid and support coming from China. It may look towards China. It may even look towards China to actually exploit what is becoming a Cold War between the Americans and the Chinese. As you know, there's a huge surge to decouple. A huge campaign, I would say, especially from the right, to decouple from the Chinese. And
in fact, interestingly, just giving a bit of a promo, that's a program we are doing in the next couple of days here on Roundtable, the US-China relationship. But it leads me to ask you, let's say China allies itself with Saudi Arabia for whatever reasons, and thereby the United States loses a good friend in terms of security in the Middle East. What happens then?
I think in reality, to be honest, the US aid with the Saudis was never really a good fit, was not really a natural fit. There's always, emphasis on human rights. And I think those discussions on human rights and pressure to uphold human rights is something which a lot of the Gulf countries are comfortable with. And having aid conditioned on human rights, as we've seen since the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, is not something the Saudis are very happy with. And we saw Mohammed bin Salman traveling to China in last year. Many saw that as a way of him pivoting to the Chinese and showing to the Americans, if you're going to threaten me with sanctions, if you're going to threaten me with laws within Congress to defund the Saudis, pull your investment and pull your soldiers and troops, I have another ally in the Chinese. So I think...
And they don't care quite so much about human rights. No, I get the point. Let me bring Jameel back in this. Do you think 2030, the vision, is gone forever?
It's not gone forever, but I think the ultimate execution, or whatever the pictures present at the end, will not be what was promised back in 2016. I remember rightly, that was when the 2030 vision to diversify, to open up, and everything else was really presented. It's going to be a much more minimal execution than really what was provided, a huge euphoria of opportunities. Now, I think that China does have an interesting position in this, but really, when you're in trouble and when an economy needs help, or financial aid specifically in that region, you look for, in a family analogy, you would look for the grandfather or somebody older to provide wisdom. But in truth, what a lot of that region has done is look for Saudi Arabia towards aid. So I think with the economic challenges that this pandemic's going to bring, as well as the double trouble of low oil prices, it provides less opportunity to get aid from Saudi Arabia, specifically when you're seeing that the PIF, the Prince's Investment Fund, is actually looking at getting some loans from somewhere else.
Okay, a quick one, if I may, to you, Nasim, as we come to the end of this. I posed the question in the first half of the program about not having available cash to buy weaponry, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think that means the war in Yemen will be wound down?
Well, it has been wound down, and Saudis have been trying to wind it down because there's no way they can maintain a war at the same time, suffer the kind of losses they are suffering domestically. So there seems to be no other option but to wind down and also reduce its foreign policy ambitions, whether it be against opposition to the Qataris, Muslim Brotherhood, and all these other organizations that the Saudis oppose. I think those campaigns will need to be wound down because they just don't have the means and the capability to continue the kind of foreign policy they have been pursuing in the last 10 years.
Extraordinary times. Thank you very much indeed. Who would have said back in 1973, when the oil price wars first started, that Saudi Arabia, less than 50 years into the future, might well be, if not a spent force, then certainly one that's sort of burnt out to some extent. Thank you very, very much indeed. And of course, no chance at all probably that the Hajj will take place this year, and that would have brought billions into the Saudi economy too. Listen, we appreciate your time very, very much indeed. Thank you for coming on the programme, and thank you for watching this edition of Roundtable. From me, David Foster, and from the team that made it all possible, we hope to have your company next time. Until then, goodbye.